My name is Meredith Allen. I'm the general manager for Sutton, Kimball, and Menard Groundwater Conservation Districts. And we're going to start off with Alyson McDonald. Alyson is the senior hydrologist at Collier Consulting, and she specializes in eco-hydrology of semi-arid environments. You can read more about Alyson in your booklet. She has her full bio there, so I encourage you to look at that, and we'll get started with Alyson.
Thank you, Meredith. And please excuse me, I'm freezing. My nose is running, so if I shiver, that's why. It is really cold in here. Maybe somebody will hear me and turn the temperature up a little bit. All right. Well, I have a sweater, so I'm really happy to be here. These are some of my favorite people in the room. Yesterday, again, as I listened to the talks, especially in the afternoon, I was reminded why we have local groundwater management, and I am so thankful, and I'm thankful to all of you out there who make those tough decisions and work really hard on our behalf. Let me see if I can make the clicker work. Oh, it did work. So I'm going to talk a little bit about GACs. It's amazing that the groundwater industry came up with another acronym, but we did. Groundwater availability certifications are not new. They've been around for a few decades, but they're definitely kind of undergoing a renewed interest. So we're going to talk a little bit about the background, some about Chapter 230, a good bit about aquifer testing, and then wrap up with a checklist. But before I launch into that, just raise your hand if you've ever had someone new to your district call you because they've drilled a dry well. How about somebody call and ask you when their water's going to be turned on? Oh, that's not some good news to deliver. How about somebody who has just finished constructing a new home and now they want to drill a well? They've contacted a driller and the driller says there's no water there. Fun times, right? Okay, so I think a lot of those type of situations are the reason that GACs are getting some renewed interest, and also for recent legislation, which we were kind of wondering what was going to happen when I submitted this topic. As it turns out, Senate Bill 2440, which Leah talked about earlier, did pass both chambers, signed by the governor, takes effect January 1st. And this is a paraphrase of her summary. So essentially, I mentioned that the GAC process is a few decades old. One of my colleagues, Brad Cross, was at TCEQ when they were drafting this process and these guidelines. I want to say he told me that was in the 1980s, and at that time they thought every county would adopt that procedure or process. They did not, but now each county or municipality they shall require a groundwater availability certification to be submitted with a plat for a new subdivision. There are some exceptions, and Leah mentioned these this morning. If the entity, based on credible evidence, thinks that there is groundwater available now and in the future for this proposed subdivision, and either they're pulling water from the Gulf Coast Aquifer or the Carrizo-Wilcox, or the property will be subdivided into 10 lots or less, they can waive this requirement. So that's not 10 acres or less, it's 10 parcels or less. So there are some exceptions where counties can waive the GAC requirement, but what I've seen in the last year and a half, which dates back to the first time I heard about a GAC, is that counties are adopting this process because in some cases there is uncertainty about water availability, and subdivisions are moving into rural areas and they find this pressure. They feel responsible, but many counties don't have a staff engineer. So their first line of defense, if you will, is to adopt something that's already existing that just gives them a little bit of a roadmap. And then in some cases, there are known areas of limited groundwater availability, and this process just gives them kind of a framework to work from, which leads me to the reason I selected this as a topic, and that is just, at the end of this, I'm hoping to give groundwater districts maybe just a little bit of background, something to go on when these come in your email inbox or across your desk, because many counties rely on their groundwater districts to review these and to provide some type of guidance. A little bit about the background, and then moving into Chapter 230. So this is Title 30 of the Texas Administrative Code. This is what it looks like. I don't know how many pages that is, but you can get it online. Not surprisingly, it includes lots of administrative information about the proposed subdivision, where it's located, how many acres there are, how many lots, how many houses they anticipate having, how many occupants per household, what the annual water demand will be. And they are supposed to separate out the household water demand with other water demand. Then it's also supposed to include some general information about the proposed water source, whichever aquifer they're proposing to provide water to the new subdivision. And this Chapter 230 also includes a form that every developer has to submit, the GAC, along with the plat. And it's quite thorough. 230.8, obtaining site-specific groundwater data. We're going to spend much of our next few minutes on this, and that's followed up by some information about the water quality within the proposed subdivision, also the determination of groundwater availability. 230.10 relies on 230.8, and then lastly, this groundwater availability and usability, that is the certification. And that has to be signed and stamped by a licensed engineer or a licensed geoscientist. So 230.8, this section on obtaining site-specific groundwater data is provided in detail in the code. It applies only to subdivisions that are to be supplied water by individual wells on individual lots. And on my screen here, it looks pretty obvious, but there's lots of little orange dots all in a row. Every single household there has a well. And I don't know if anybody from Upper Trinity is in here, but this is in Brock. There you are. So, yeah. You look at aerial imagery of the state of Texas and you can see, there's a platted subdivision. Everybody has their own individual well. And there is a limit. Just a short tangent. I heard Doug speak at the Water Summit in Mineral Wells last week. And he had a lot of good things to say, but the most striking thing he said was, if people weren't watering their yards, he may not have used these exact words. If people were not watering their yards, if it were not for the outdoor irrigation, we would not be having this conversation. So that really stuck with me. Doug has some really unique circumstances, challenges in Upper Trinity, but Anyway, this aerial image is a very good example of why there's so much emphasis on groundwater availability certifications. That middle bullet, the pumping test or aquifer test, those are used synonymously. That really is the backbone of the GAC. And the pumping test is used to stress the aquifer so that we can determine how water is stored and transmitted in the aquifer. The pumping test is not designed to represent the anticipated types and operations of wells in the proposed subdivision. It's not to say that those wells cannot be converted to domestic wells to serve those individual lots. Certainly they can, but that is not the purpose of the pumping test. The purpose of the pumping test is to stress the aquifer so that we can calculate storativity and transmissivity. And one of the reasons, of course, for uncertainty is aquifer material. You know, we have lots of carboniferous aquifers, lots of limestone in Texas. This would provide a very different well than this or this, and that spatial variability is what leads to our uncertainty and can lead to those kind of dreadful phone calls like I started off with asking about. Igneous aquifers in West Texas. It would be great to have a well, you know, in one of these fractures or voids here, not so much over here. So spatial variability is really important, and pumping tests are one of the most practical ways that we can get this information. Alluvium also is very different. So all of this aquifer material, the spatial variability, is one of the reasons that pumping tests are vital and very valuable. And I see it as a win-win, requiring this additional well drilling, testing, logging. It's an advantage for everyone because we all get to take advantage of the new information. And just recently, the Water Development Board has set up a repository for pumping test information. So excited about things to come. So a little bit more about the aquifer test. It's very simple. It's a multi-well test. It consists of a pumping well, sometimes called the test well, and at least one observation well. Ideally, two. Ideally, you can measure the response to the pumping up gradient and down gradient. Sometimes you can have observation wells in adjacent aquifers to look at hydraulic communication among aquifers. But most often it is a pumping well and a single observation well. The code requires, of course, that they be located on the property, you know, within the proposed property boundary. They have a specified latitude and longitude. They have to be completed in the same aquifer or water-bearing formation. And they also provide some spacing guidelines. So for unconfined aquifers, the pumping well and observation well are not to be more than 300 feet apart, the horizontal distance. For confined aquifers, not more than 700 feet apart. There is a statement in there about, you know, well spacing also is up to the professional judgment of the engineer, the geoscientist who's conducting the test and certifying the groundwater availability. So the pumping test is nothing more than dropping transducers down the pumping well and the observation well, recording some background data, typically several days to maybe up to 10 days, 2 weeks. Turn the pump on at a constant pumping rate. You measure the drawdown, run it for 24 hours, shut the pump off, measure recovery. Typically, this code specifies to 90% of the pre-pumping water level. That's very standard, nothing out of the ordinary. And this is kind of a textbook case. So we've got our background data here. Turn the pump on, observe drawdown, run it for 24 hours, shut the pump off, measure recovery. And this is a beautiful pumping test. Textbook. They don't always look like that. This is not a pumping test. So they did pump the well. They may have tested the pump, but it is not an aquifer test. So we conduct our pumping test, process, prepare the raw data, and most often, unless you're a student, most often you get to use software that allows you to do manual or automatic curve fitting to calculate transmissivity and storativity. I got a couple of, oh, okay. I think I'm missing a line, but anyway. In addition to the water level data that you've collected, you got to know the radius of the borehole, the radius of the casing, the radius of the downhole equipment, and from that, we get transmissivity and storativity. That information, those parameters allow us to calculate drawdown over time and distance, and that has to be included on the form that's part of Chapter 230. So what's required right now is drawdown at the pumping well and at the property boundary in 10 years and 30 years. And that also is to be included on the form. From that, we can get recommended well spacing and well production. So this is a common question. Can an existing well be used? Yes, the code allows for an existing well to be used as an observation well, provided that it's completed in the same aquifer or water-bearing formation, and that it's within an acceptable distance from the pumping well. I would say it's always a good idea to go ahead and video a candidate existing well to confirm completion, screen placement, and also condition of the screen to ensure that it's not clogged or damaged, so that you can rely on the observation data that you collect from that well. Another common question is, well, can't I just use an existing pumping test? Well, if you're real lucky, there might be an existing pumping test within 1/4 mile of the property boundary, because that is what's allowed in the code. And I've yet to come across a proposed subdivision where there is a pumping test within 1/4 mile. I know there were a lot done in the High Plains and the South Plains in the 50s and 60s. It's a little less common, a little less frequent for the rest of the state, but yes, that is a possibility. Another condition of using an existing pumping test besides the 1/4 mile distance from the property boundary is that the pumping test must have been conducted when aquifer conditions were very similar to what they are today. Now that leaves a lot of room for conjecture, kind of like that early on based on credible evidence. That's kind of tricky too, but the last thing that's required are lithology and geophysical logs. So description of the depth, thickness of the water-bearing formation, the depth to the water table, and also the geophysical logs. Now there is a allowance for waiving the geophysical logs if the entity, the county or the municipality, does not think that the geophysical logging is required to characterize the aquifer. So if an aquifer has been well characterized, there's a lot of existing logs, the geophysical log requirement can be waived. So we've talked about the background of GACs, a little bit about the code, some about pumping test, and I would say that not all pumping tests, not all GACs are created equal. So your first one to come in the door may be a Ferrari, or it might be a Ford Pinto. And I will follow this up by saying, you know, we're all kind of adjusting to this new process and this new idea. So have a little grace with yourself and with the people who are submitting this and the county. We're all kind of working this out. And I think Leah mentioned in her legislative summary that TCEQ, of course, drafted this. This is their code, and they also have the authority to revise it. So for now, this is what it looks like. That could change. So we're all working through this, and we're learning as we go. So just a checklist that hopefully will give you kind of a starting point, something to refer back to. I always look, number one, at the completed form that's in the code. Read through that, familiarize myself with, you know, where this is, the total size of it, how many lots are they proposing, did they submit a plat? One thing I've noticed with, you know, limited experience with this is that sometimes the developer really doesn't know how much water is there, and before they even decide how many lots they want to create, they kind of want to know how much water is there, which is smart. So sometimes the plat is one of the last things to come. All of the existing wells should be located and identified on that map, on the plat. I also like to verify the distance between the wells. And this is not only to meet the code requirements, but also usually when I get a plat, it's from somebody who has altered the scale and sent it as an attachment to an email. So if I can't confirm that the scale is still correct, I will be sure and follow up and make sure that what the actual horizontal distance is between the pumping well and the observation well. Also, the well construction, they are supposed to include diagrams. There should be, the SDR report should be attached to that, just to look and see, you know, if the wells are screened in the same aquifer. Just very basic information to confirm and familiarize myself with the project. Also, the pumping test data with the calculations. The code specifies that all data and all calculations are to be provided to the county or the municipality that they're submitting this to. And it's a good idea early on, if you see they haven't provided that in a usable format, to go ahead and request it, because it might take them some time to get you their Excel spreadsheet or the data that came right off the pressure transducer, off of the data logger. And there's a reason I'm encouraging you to ask for that. I'll take a cursory look at water quality, make sure they've sampled for the secondary MCLs, which are required, and see what the lab results look like there. And then any logs that may have been required or provided. So here's some pumping test data. I mentioned that they rarely turn out perfect. And this is a 36-hour test, so this would be for a public supply well. Those requirements are, those come under Chapter 290, so that would be for a public supply well. So that's why it says 36-hour instead of 24-hour. But anyway, this is a new well that Collier designed, constructed, developed, conducted a step test to determine the appropriate pumping rate for the 36-hour test. And then we started the 36-hour test. And you can see there's a little bumping around here. That could be additional development of the well, since it's a new well. So you want to look for these things like background data, some unusual patterns. You want to look for the recovery, look at maximum drawdown. We had a pumping test that was submitted, and the data from the observation well it had this sine wave, this very clear sine wave, and it was really odd. And even the geoscientist who was submitting it said that something wasn't right, and he thought he could just use part of the data or maybe try and shave that off. And I said, well, it just looks like an equipment malfunction. Why don't you contact the manufacturer? And they did, and it turns out it was a simple solution, and we got good data. So always look at the raw data. If something doesn't look right, it doesn't mean you have to necessarily start over. It just means you got to dig a little deeper and figure out what's going on. The observation or the background data is really important. Sometimes there's noise that's caused by nearby pumping wells, or you need to know if there's some type of other influence on the response in the observation well besides just the pumping well. Not only do you need to know that, but the person who's conducting the test, analyzing the data, and certifying it also needs to know. But for your own peace of mind, it's always a good idea to look closely at the raw data, including the background data. So, of course, I'm curious, what's the static level, the maximum drawdown, and the total volume pumped. And they have to record that as well, because another blank on the form is the specific capacity of the pumping well. And then some cursory calculations. Again, just as a first pass, I open it up, and these are just the initial things. Hydraulic conductivity with our major and minor aquifers, we have a huge range in hydraulic conductivity. Transmissivity and storativity, not so much. You look at those numbers. Are they within a normal range, or are they something kind of unexpected? The aquifer thickness that they're stating for that particular property, and the transmissivity. So transmissivity is just the product of the hydraulic conductivity times the saturated thickness, and all of that information is provided on the form, so you can calculate that very quickly and say, does this make sense for a sandstone aquifer or for karst or something like that, just to see if the numbers seem reasonable. And lastly, so I mentioned the existing pumping tests. Report 98 was the volume 1 of the board's assessment of pumping test data. They go through it, review it, summarize it, publish it. Those were mostly the South Plains, High Plains. More recently, there were like a couple of hundred pumping tests in 71 counties that are reported in that second volume there, Report 381. So those are good resources. If that this is required in your county, people are asking about pumping tests, that gives you something to kind of compare to see if what they're submitting is reasonable. The board also has a drawdown tool. So at the very least, if you take the transmissivity and storativity that has been provided on the form, plug it into their tool with the pumping rate that they specified, look to see what their drawdown is that they're on the tool, and compare that to what they've reported. These are just quick, easy ways for you to see if they're in the ballpark of what you should expect. This QR code will take you directly to Chapter 230 if you're interested in taking a peek at that. And lastly, this is my contact information. And the big one over there on the right is more about Collier Consulting. We're based in Stephenville, and we're hiring. So we are a great place to work. We work really hard. One of my bosses over there, we work really, really hard. But we play hard too. And our engineering group right now, it's a big group, but we have a guy named Ross and a guy named Chandler in there. So if your name is Phoebe or Monica or Joey, and you want to apply to be part of our engineering group, you will get extra consideration. So, and that is all. I don't know if I have time for questions. Okay.
Thank you so much, Alyson. Is there any questions? If you could go to your microphone, we'll have a little bit of time for a couple of questions.
Yeah, I'll ask one. We've worked with the Blanco County Commissioners on water availability studies for many years. We have an interlocal agreement with them. They get a water availability study in, I review it, and fortunately I've been able to help them work on their subdivision regulations. And one of the issues that came up, which I've discussed with them, is we're getting all these water availability studies, aquifer tests done on individual subdivisions, but they as county commissioners are worried about the cumulative effect. And so I've talked with them about the possibility of them requiring that anybody conducting an aquifer test or a water availability test, if there's an existing test that's been done within, pick a distance, quarter of a mile, half a mile, third of a mile, I don't really care. I could make an argument for any one of those probably. But do you see if there's any major issues involved in taking your specific subdivision aquifer testing water availability study and reviewing it with an eye toward the previous one that was done or the existing one that's done and kind of combining the cumulative effects of those two? I don't think you have to combine the data, but I'm just saying, is it a big hurdle to try and look at this other study that's already existing and see how it compares with the one you're reporting, and then include those comments or observations in your report?
Yeah, thank you, Ron. I think that's a great idea. And that might be something that TCEQ considers, or it might be something that just each of us considers doing, is going ahead and taking the drawdown, I guess you could call it the radius of influence, and plotting that along with the one for the new subdivision and see how much overlap or interference there might be. Yeah, it's a great idea.
I think it's probably within the authority of a groundwater district's requiring the study or the report to be done, or as part of the TCQ aquifer test requirements. I think it's a legitimate requirement, and it's just not being done right now. But as this growth continues, we're going to have to look at cumulative effects.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I didn't mention this, but the code does specify that one copy is to be sent to, of course, the plating committee at the county level, one to be sent to the Texas Water Development Board, one to be sent to TCEQ, and one to be sent to the Groundwater Conservation District, if there is one. So, yeah, I think that's a great idea. Yes, sir? The range of cost. If you have to drill a test well and an observation well? I would say without the cost of the design and construction of the wells, you're looking at around $65,000 to $70,000, and then you're looking at the investment of the two wells. I do like to point out that those are an asset. Once they're drilled, they are sold as an asset to whoever purchases that individual lot. And if the groundwater availability process, the pumping test, proves out that there should be water available for the next 10 years and 30 years, then that also makes the property more valuable. So the developer has the best chance of recovering that investment than anyone